Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third in our true crime series. Today, we are talking about crooks and killers, political high crimes, and assassins. So before we begin, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will answer those at the end or as we go along if we see them. And please know that the credit link will be posted at the end of the session. So if you are here because one of your instructors gives you credit or extra credit, look for that link at the end. Make sure you fill it out and make sure that you include what professor has asked you to attend so that I can send that to them and you get your credit. My name is Misty Wilson Mertens. I teach history and government here at the Connect campus, and I am the social sciences chair. And I am joined today by Professor Kimberly Cox, who is one of our government instructors. Kimberly, do you want to say hi?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great.
So today we're talking about, like I said, high crimes, misdemeanors, political assassins, and their goals. But before we started, I wanted to ask you, Professor Cox, how common are these crimes?
They're pretty common. It's interesting because we see criminal activity in all three branches of government at both the state and federal level. And so the picture on the screen, I'll kind of kick this off. This is from 1798. It's an illustration that was done and put in the papers. And the congressman who got in trouble in this is Matthew Lyon. And he was from Kentucky, and he spit tobacco juice in the face of a guy named Roger Griswold from Connecticut, who's also a congressperson. So there's this big to do, and he was kind of in trouble. And also, he did some things that got him in trouble with President Adams, and he was found guilty and actually put in jail for violating Adams's Alien and Sedition Act. He actually served 4 months, campaigned while he was in jail, and was reelected to the House. So it was a big to do, and that's just one example of how I guess common it is that we have high crimes or we have other criminal activity within um, the branches of government. And I think what shocked me the most was um, how often those who committed crimes or were even accused of some of these really terrible things were reelected. But anyway, so I know. If you really want to, I know it's Wikipedia, but they have a list of crimes both at the federal and state level that is just shocking how many there are. So yes, it happens more than we think. But as far as high crimes and misdemeanors, as of 2022, 20 people have had impeachment proceedings brought against them. So that would be by the U.S. House of Representatives. So we've had actually, and it's supposed to be four presidents. So four presidents: Johnson, Nixon, Clinton, and Trump. A bunch of judges, so 15 judges. One senator, it's William Blount from 1797, and a Secretary of War in 1876. And so basically what happened to these people, if you're curious, there was 8 acquittals, 8 convictions, and 3 dismissals. Excuse me, and one resignation. That was Nixon. So um, all the
Can you
other 3
just really
presidents were
quickly
acquitted.
remind us, what does it mean to be impeached?
To be impeached, excuse me. So the House basically will bring charges. So when you're talking about impeachment and removal, it's a two-part process. So you have the House, which does the impeachment. I think of that as the trial portion. They're going to look at all the evidence and decide, is there enough there to then move to the next setting where you'll do an official trial, which is done in the Senate. So the Senate then will look at all the evidence and they decide if they're going to actually remove that person. So that's the general, very non-technical way to describe an impeachment, but think of it
Yeah, I
as
always
we're
tell
going to
my students
investigate and try.
that the House is like the grand jury, and then the Senate is the actual trial.
And that's a really good way to look at it, I think, because you're looking at the evidence in the first part, which is the House side, and then the Senate side actually makes the decision. So they'd be like the trial and the jury. Um, and I know because everybody always asks with the presidents, to be formally impeached to, you got to have a formal vote on the articles of impeachment. So for Johnson and Clinton and Trump, that did happen, but technically Nixon resigned. They did actually finish and an article of impeachment were filed and given to the floor, but the vote just didn't happen on Nixon. So, that's kind of that one. And then Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, if you look at it, and I have it there on the first bullet point, it is very vague as to what a high crime or misdemeanor is. So when they're looking at impeachment, they're looking at high crimes and misdemeanors. There's not any real definition. Most legal scholars, and we've had this debate recently, and they still said it in the last 4 years, that it is what Congress defines it as. And in my opinion, that's not very helpful. So I don't know what everybody else thinks, but I just think that's not very helpful. So if you look and you dig into the history of this particular term, there is some. Alexander Hamilton wrote some information that put in the Federalist Papers. He defined it as political, but George Mason, who was the representative of Virginia working on this particular clause of the Constitution, he wanted tacked on maladministration, and because he thought that treason and bribery, which were initially the only pieces listed, were too vague, and so he suggested he said maladministration, and Madison comes back and says, no, 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 I don't like that, that's too vague too. And so they offered up other high crimes and misdemeanors against the state, and then it turned into high crimes and misdemeanors. And looking at I was in school, I took American legal history, and in that one, if you look at the American legal history scholars, high crimes and misdemeanors is an English common law term. So it means things like tax evasion, obstruction of justice, etc. So that term, high crimes and misdemeanors, would have been really common at the time they were putting together the Constitution. That's why I think they used it. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. So even before we were a nation, I really want to stress that this is nothing new. People in power have always done things that have gotten them in trouble. So I think our most famous example in American history has got to be Benedict Arnold. So Benedict Arnold is a general in the Continental Army serving in the Revolutionary War. He is fighting with the Americans under George Washington. Arnold is crucial to the Battle of Saratoga. Without Arnold, we do not win the Battle of Saratoga, and Saratoga is a turning point in the war. If we don't win at Saratoga, we don't get aid from the French, we don't win the war. So Benedict Arnold, very, very critical to the American victory. But he was feeling underappreciated. He felt like his work wasn't getting acknowledged, and he just married a new wife, and she was also telling him that and telling him how much better the British would treat him. So he got command at West Point, and he entered into negotiations with the British. He weakened the defenses at West Point, he thinned out the supplies, and he had a plan with the British that would basically allow them to capture West Point. And at West Point, we had some critical logistics information. So that would have been a major, major, major help to the British in this war effort. Ultimately, we were able to discover his betrayal, and he flees to New York City before he can get in trouble. But his name becomes kind of the go-to when you think of an American traitor. If you think of traitor, you think of Benedict Arnold. But like I said, he was crucial to the victory at Saratoga. So if you go to Saratoga today, they wanted to in some way acknowledge what Arnold had done, but you can't put up a statue of a traitor. You just can't do that. So the compromise was they put a statue up of his leg, because during the battle he was wounded in his leg. So if you go and you see this statue of a boot, that's what it's about.
So this is his crushed leg from that he limped. Didn't he limp? He limped, and that was part of it. He was kind of out of action for a while, right?
Yes, that's why he got put to West Point, because he couldn't be on the battlefield for a little bit.
Makes sense.
I think another very common image that comes to mind when we think about high crimes that politicians are committing would be the famous duel between Burr and Hamilton. Dueling was very common in the 17 and 1800s. This is a carryover from Old England, but there is a thing known as a gentleman's duel. So the idea here is judicial combat, meaning God will decide the winner. And if you win the duel, it's because you were virtuous and correct. God was on your side, and the other person was obviously wrong or a villain because God was not on their side. The vast majority of duels end without actually shots being fired. It's more of a show of manliness that you're able to face the duel. But we do have several duels that occur in American history. Many of our founding fathers engaged in dueling. I think the most prolific was probably Andrew Jackson, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But the most famous duel is going to be between Hamilton and Burr. So if you guys have listened to the musical Hamilton, you probably know most of the story. But Burr is our vice president. He realizes he is not going to be on the ticket for the next term because him and Thomas Jefferson have had some issues. So he decides while he is still vice president to run for governor of New York. Hamilton lives in New York. He absolutely does not want to see Burr elected. So he's going to do what he always does. He writes a series of attacks on Burr. They are very pointed attacks. Some of them not just on his politics, but on his character. So Burr is going to ask for a duel in order to correct the attacks by Hamilton. He called it an affair of honor. So Burr is asking for a gentleman's duel. Dueling is illegal in New York, but that law had not yet passed in New Jersey. So they go across the river, they go to New Jersey, they have this duel. Hamilton fires, hits a tree limb. The tree limb hits Burr, which is what you're seeing there in that little picture in the circle. And then Burr fires and actually shoots Hamilton, and Hamilton will die of that injury. Dueling is interesting because we have here a vice president of the United States that has shot and killed someone. But dueling has a built-in defense. If someone shoots at you, are you not allowed to shoot back? That's self-defense, right? So if you're dueling, that's the automatic defense you're going to use. I had to shoot. He shot at me first. And technically that is true. There's a little bit of an addendum to the story. I'm sorry, Professor Cox, I cut you off.
I was gonna say, doesn't Burr, isn't there like some conspiracy around Burr after the fact too?
So after this, in 1805, Burr realizes that he's not going to be governor and he's obviously not going to be vice president. So he is going to go off to the Spanish territories and he is going to try to come up with a plan to create a new country. We have him working with Mexico at one point, working with the Spanish, with the French, with Americans. So he has kind of ties everywhere, and he gets double-crossed by somebody who turns him in. So in 1806, Burr is in New Orleans, and he is going to be arrested. In 1807, he is tried for treason. He gets off on a technicality. In the Constitution, to be tried for treason, there has to be witnesses against you. Everyone that was arrested in Burr refused to testify against him, because if they testify, then they are also guilty of treason. So a little bit of a technicality, but Burr gets off.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting because there's always the Texas connection too, like because there was this, idea of, trying to create a new country with Texas and, the West, and I don't know. I think it's kind of fun.
I will give Burr a little bit of credit for, he had his daughter educated as if she would be an empress one day. So he's nice to hand off power to his daughter, which is an interesting thing for a founding father to think to do. All right, so that was all kind of in the early era of our country, but now we're going to turn to talk about crimes against presidents. So the first major crime against a president is going to come with the attempted assassination of Andrew Jackson. This story is wild. In 1835, Jackson is gathering up politicians in the Capitol building for a funeral of another representative, and Richard Lawrence, who is an unemployed painter, attacks him. He pulls a pistol out. The pistol misfires. So Jackson grabs his walking cane, lunges toward Lawrence, and starts beating him. As he's attacking him, Lawrence pulls out a second pistol, and the second pistol also misfires. So we've had some arms experts do a calculation on this, and the likelihood of both of those pistols misfiring is a 1 in 125,000 chance.
That's lucky
for Jackson. It's almost impossible, right? Lawrence had come to believe that the government of the United States owed him money because he was in line for the throne in England. Now, this is a complete delusion on his part, but it shows that he is not mentally well. And that's going to be a pattern that we see with the assassins going forward. It's one of two categories. Either they are not mentally well or they have a political goal. In this case, we're almost fully and then not mentally well because, again, he thinks that he is in line for the throne of England and that if he shoots the president, he will get money from the United States government who recognizes that he is in line for the throne. It kind of falls apart if you use a lot of logic. So moving on, we have our probably most famous assassination.
Yeah, and the picture that I have there is the bullet that killed Lincoln. And you can visit this if you want to, and bone fragments from his skull, which is kind of morbid, at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. And I just thought that was fascinating. I went down the rabbit hole looking at all these different pictures. But another place I think, in talking about true crime, is that you can still see a lot of the pieces of this and read about it in books and see it in musicals like Hamilton. But one of the places I think that's really cool is the Ford's Theater and Museum. It's run by the National Park Service, and they have memorabilia. If you ever get to go to DC, it's fun. Booth's Derringer, Lincoln's clothes. There's a life mask of Lincoln's face, pillow, and what I love, pictures of women from Booth's pocket, including a supposed fiance, Lucy Hale. So Lucy Hale's really interesting. I'll mention him being at an inauguration for Lincoln here a second, but she was the daughter of John P. Hale, who was the first abolitionist ever elected to Senate, and I think the current ambassador to Spain at the time the incident happened. Another thing at the Ford's Theater site that you can do right now, if you want to, is they have a virtual tour. It's courtesy of Google Arts that's really interesting. And also, the Library of Congress has a display case, which I get to visit, that has stuff from Lincoln's pockets from the night as well. So, I just, because we're mentioning true crime, I think it's always interesting that a lot of this stuff, there are museums and displays of a lot of this around the country that are interesting to visit. But going back to the assassination, so Lincoln was assassinated while watching a play called Our American Cousin. He was at Ford's Theater, which is why I mentioned it, and this was on April 14th of 1865. And so, to give you guys context, the surrender for the end of the Civil War at Appomattox Courthouse, General Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, that had only taken place. A couple days earlier on April 9th, 1865. So 5 days, if I do my math right. The war at that time technically does go on for several more months. So we have the, I guess, official surrender at Appomattox, but the war goes on for several months because we don't have the tech today. Word is going to spread slowly. So, for example, I think one of the last battles of the Civil War is here in Texas near Palmetto Ranch. That's near Brownsville on in May of 1865. I think May 13th. So, um, and at that particular battle, Confederate soldiers won, but I guess I want to put one in air quotes if you could see me, because technically the actual surrender of the Civil War had already happened. Lincoln was already dead on May 13th. When this last battle takes place, he actually dies on April 15th, and federal troops won't arrive in Texas to begin Reconstruction era until May 30th. So it's all to kind of give you context that there are still high tensions going on at the time Lincoln's killed. Everything's still a little precarious. Word's not spreading fast at this point. And so, talking about the assassination in more detail, it's not the first attempt. Supposedly there were five, possibly more, but five that were documented prior to that. So 9 months before Ford Theater, for example, Lincoln, I think this is the one most people have heard of, was riding to what was called the Cottage. It's a house in Northwest Washington D.C. And there was a shot that rang out and spooked his horse. And later, when they go back to retrieve his hat that was knocked off. There's a supposed a musket ball hole that was in the hat. Um, Lincoln, according to the cottage, by the way, has a website too. It's a museum. Allegedly refused to believe that he'd been shot at and that anyone wanted to kill him. That's in the museum's website, so it was kind of interesting. And all reading about this, he seems to be a risk taker too, and did not like having like a presidential detail around him, like any kind of protection around him. So another thing that was interesting, and mentioning one more attempt, is, and this is also on the Cottage website, they talk about an incident at Fort Stevens, which is the picture on the slide. That's a picture of the battle at Fort Stevens. So Fort Stevens is near where the Cottage is. And Lincoln apparently had been made to evacuate the Cottage to go to the White House because this battle was about to happen. He rides back out with some other, you know, people from the White House to view the battle and to view the troops. And when gunfire starts breaking out a little bit too close to him, he and his company are exposed. In fact, a Union surgeon is hit who's standing right near Lincoln, and Secretary of War Edward Stanton supposedly is forced to get Lincoln out of there. And there's this quote that the cottage has that they say that basically the Stanton says he's going to compel him to go by ambulance if he won't go. And Lincoln complained to him that, hey, I'm the president. I can do what I want. So I thought that was really interesting. Whoops.
Yeah, something else that's interesting about Lincoln is just the extent to which John Wilkes Booth went.
Oh yeah, he's out for Lincoln for quite a while. I mean, this guy, he's an interesting character because he comes from a famous acting family, his brother as well. And he's someone who's been acting since I think he first appears on the stage like at age 17 or 18. But by the time of the assassination, he's really well known. He's kind of famous. As far as him working within the Confederacy, he was a part of the Richmond Grays militia until after the raid on Harper's Ferry. But that's really interesting because he actually is known to have attended John Brown of Harper's Ferry, the John Brown execution as part of the militia. Um, he feels that Lincoln suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War, and what habeas corpus is your right of habeas corpus is that they can't just detain you forever in a jail. You have to be brought before court and a judge and told what you did wrong, what your charge is. So during the Civil War, and this happens a lot. This happens in war a lot. It's not unusual, but Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, and so um, John Wilkes Booth says this is unconstitutional. He's really upset about this. He's also a Southern sympathizer, obviously pro-slavery, and initially he was part of a plot to kidnap Lincoln and use him as ransom in exchange for Southern prisoners because the South was needing to get some of their troops back. At one point, they were running low on people, and they were willing to kidnap Lincoln to exchange for prisoners so they could get some of their soldiers back at that point in the war. That didn't happen. Again, Booth also was supposedly a member of the Confederate Secret Service running messages and medicine back and forth across enemy lines. He supposedly used his fame as an actor, and everybody knew him, to travel freely between the South and the North. But after the surrender at Appomattox, he really shifts his thought process from kidnapping to assassination. He hears the speech at the inauguration. He's very against slaves having freedom, and more so if you read the documents on it, citizenship rights that would go along with that for freed slaves. And this picture that I have on the slide, he is seen at the second inauguration of President Lincoln as Lucy Hale. Remember, I mentioned Lucy Hale before as her date. And supposedly afterwards, he says to a friend, "What an excellent chance I had to kill the president if I had wished on Inauguration Day." Because you can see, they're highlighted there, Lincoln, and he's kind of up in the balcony. He would have had a perfect sightline to shoot at Lincoln. But to wrap up this slide, his group eventually plotted to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, also, and Lincoln at Ford's Theater. So this will be a plan of 3 killings. And so the plan was to kill them all in the same night. So Lincoln, Johnson, and Seward would be killed all in the same night. A man named George, and I'm going to really mispronounce his name, at Adsert. Do you know how to say his name? Atserdote?
I do not.
That's a hard one. He actually bails. He decides not to kill Johnson. He just says, "Nope, not going to do it." And so Vice President Johnson will become president after the assassination, and then will be the first president impeached. To kind of wrap it back to that, he's impeached, but he's acquitted for violating the Tenure of Office Act when he removed Secretary of War Edward Stanton from office. So just to kind of tie it into impeachment, these all kind of go together. Lewis Powell is supposed to kill Seward. Um, Powell, while Booth is hunting down Lincoln, goes to Seward's house on Lafayette Square, which is really close to the White House. Um, Seward is asleep. He's recovering from a really bad carriage accident. He broken his jaw and his arm. And so his family's with him, and his daughter is actually attending him in the room. Pal, the assassin, knocks on the door claiming that he's bringing medicine for Seward. And Seward's son opens the door but refuses. Here, Pal says, "Oh, I need to take this medicine upstairs personally to Seward." And Pal's son says, "No, you're not going upstairs. I have no clue who you are." They actually come to blows, and Pal shoots at the son, but the gun won't fire. Again, another misfire. Guns don't apparently fire real well back in that time. He pistol whips the son and runs upstairs. He and the son are bleeding. The son's in pursuit, and now Pal takes out this big Bowie knife, and the daughter is screaming by the time he gets into the room. Pal dives at Seward, slashing at everybody and everyone in the room, and finally Pal runs off. And there's a really interesting account with Fanny, the daughter, who recounts just the amount of blood everywhere afterwards from the stabbings. Seward actually pulls through and lives. He has a big scar on his face from the knife. And obviously, I said Andrew Johnson becomes Secretary of State, but Lincoln at Ford's Theater obviously does not fare as well. Booth creeps into the president's box, shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, and leaps to the stage. And famously, we think he says, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus ever to tyrants." Or there's another, "The South is avenged," is another thing they think he might have said as he flees, jumps down and flees. Booth is found finally 12 days later in a barn in Virginia. They set the barn on fire. He refuses to come out, and he eventually is shot dead. I think there's confusion over, and I don't know, you may know, Misty, if he was shot or if he killed himself. I'm not sure if that's ever been clarified.
The official claim is that he was shot, but it's very likely he shot himself.
Yeah, I mean, the
But
barn's
there
on
was somebody who
fire.
took credit the day of.
Yeah. Yeah, I did it. I got him. But yeah, the barn's on fire. He's not coming out, so he's gone anyway. But um yeah, Lincoln's pronounced dead on April 15th. And I think one fun fact that is doing the research, that Booth keeps a diary during this 12-day, hideout, where he literally laments that he is sad that he's not a hero, and that not everybody is joyously, celebrating him for killing Lincoln. There's a huge reward. The picture on the slide shows that. And the other members of the plot are, for the most part, caught, arrested, tried by military commission. 4 were found guilty. 1 was hung. The 4 that were found guilty were sentenced to life imprisonment. There's actually 1 that received a 6-year sentence, and the person who fled eventually had their case dismissed. But that's the general, I guess, summary, because there's so much on the Lincoln assassination that you could cover. But um, one thing I wanted to wrap up with this is, looking at true crime and how it impacts things and where it's reported. And, now we see it in museums and in musicals and plays. But at the time, it was a big deal in the newspapers as well. And I had fun going down another rabbit hole with the Office of the Historian for the United States. And you can go on their site, and they have State Department reports called Condolences from the World. And you can look at all the information from all of the actual letters from each country. So I picked the one from China. You can kind of see it took forever. It took 40 days for it to get there, and they say another fortnight, which is about 2 weeks, for the news to arrive. But there's all these letters of condolences. I also found the original AP report from the night online, so you can look at the actual Associated Press report online. But it's widely reported. It's in the news for quite a while because, again, news travels really, really slowly. So,
So I'm going to be
and
really
then,
quick with the next 2, just so we get time to talk about crimes presidents have committed.
oh yeah,
So our next 2 presidents to get assassinated are going to be Garfield and McKinley. Garfield is shot just 4 months after taking office. To me, this is a real tragedy for our country because Garfield had such potential to be such a great president. When he's shot by Charles Guiteau, and Guiteau claims that he's doing this for Vice President Chester A. Arthur. He thinks if he shoots and kills Garfield, Chester A. Arthur will become president, and he will be so grateful that he will give Guiteau an appointment in the U.S. government. That is not what happens, obviously. Guiteau is eventually going to be executed for shooting the president. Unfortunately for Garfield, he does not die immediately. It takes several months for him to die because the way the bullet is lodged, it doesn't kill him immediately, but he gets sepsis, and then he eventually dies of that. This is another case of the assassin having a mental illness and not being fully aware of what their actions are and what the consequences will be. So if we skip forward one, we can contrast that with Leon Kolgosh, who shoots and kills President William McKinley in the first year of his second term. Leon Kolgosh is an anarchist, and so he believes that if he kills McKinley, he will trigger a destruction of the American government, and then anarchists can rise. Obviously, again, that is not what happens. When he kills McKinley, he is going to elevate Teddy Roosevelt to the presidency, which, if he was looking for anarchy, was exactly the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, no doubt. And speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, not all assassination attempts obviously work. Teddy Roosevelt had an attempt on his life, and this one's really interesting because he is giving a speech, and he is running for office at this point. He's not president at the time. He's running for re-election, but he's shot at and he's saved by the picture of the steel glasses case in the 50-page speech. The bullet actually does go into his body, but it lodges, I believe, in muscle, not actually anything that'll kill him at the time. And he goes on to give the speech for an hour. And at the beginning, he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I've just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill Bulmos." That's kind of the summary of it. And he shows them the blood on his shirt. So it was kind of interesting. He would the incident happens in Milwaukee, and he basically declines the medical care, and the guy who shoots him, and I'll go to the next page, sorry, is a guy named John Schrank. And he dreamt that McKinley, remember McKinley from before, that McKinley's ghost wanted revenge, or justice, or there was also some political twist to it that some think he didn't want Teddy Roosevelt to seek another term. Um, Poor Schrank is committed to an insane asylum in 1914, but in looking at the documentation, Teddy Roosevelt writes a letter to a friend, and he thinks that Schrank may not have been totally mad because he stalked him across several states. He said this guy showed intent, basically. And the letter, I pulled apart of it, says he was not really a madman at all, but rather a man of the same disorder brain, which most criminals and a great many non criminals have. And I think he's basically, I think, alluding to the fact that, if you're going to shoot someone, you can't be totally all right, mostly anyway, I'm guessing. But that's where I'm going to leave that, I guess. Um, the next one is, speaking of the Roosevelts, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And again, a distant cousin to Teddy Roosevelt, who also became his nephew because he married Eleanor Roosevelt and all that family stuff. 32nd president of the United States. And on February 15th, 1933, Giuseppe Zangara will try to assassinate President FDR in Miami, Florida. This is just 2 weeks prior to the inauguration of FDR. He was delivering a speech in the back of a car at about 9 p.m. From 9 p.m. I think at late night. And as he's finishing up, he's talking to a group of supporters, but he's standing in the car, and the supporters are gathered around him. And apparently, Zangara is short. He's only 5'1". He stands on a wobbly chair to see to shoot at FDR, fires 5 shots, yelling out, "Too many people are starving." And supposedly, the lady next to him hits at him. He misses hitting FDR, but he does hit bystanders. And the mayor of Chicago, who's part of this entourage, Anton Cermak, is shot and later is killed. I think the really interesting thing, though, is reading the newspaper articles of this. They all reported that FDR was strong, capable, and calm on the day. He went to the hospital and stayed there and made sure everybody's okay. Okay, he stayed with Cermak, trying to make sure he was going to be okay. Um, and the assassin obviously is caught. He blames the rich people for his chronic stomach pain at the time too. This is during, after Great Depression in that era. Pleads guilty. He told the judge, "I'll kill capitalists because they kill me. Stomach like drunk man, no point living. Give me the electric chair." He's sentenced to 80 years in prison initially. and then that sentence is changed to the death penalty because Cermak dies, and he's actually killed by the infamous electric chair in Florida, the old Sparky. So that is Zangara.
So 2 more attempts and one is successful. So 1963, JFK is shot and killed in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald. 75% of Americans do not believe that. So you are welcome to believe what you want, but official records say he was shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald shoots and kills Kennedy out of a desire for notoriety. So a little bit of political motivation, but also a desire to be famous. And if you look back at Oswald's life, you can see that in several of the things he does before he gets to this attempt. And unfortunately, we will never really know his full motivation because he is shot and killed by Jack Ruby just days after Kennedy is killed. And then if you go to the next one, on March 30th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan is shot by John Hinckley. John Hinckley believes that by shooting and killing Reagan, he would impress actress Jodie Foster, who he believes he has a relationship with, but that is a delusion in his mind. Hinckley was recently released, I want to say last year.
I think it was last year.
So he'd been in custody that whole time, but because of a mental illness, was not sent to death row like many of these other assassins were. All right, so that gets us mostly through crimes against presidents. Now we need to talk about presidents who have committed crimes.
And I'm going to
And
start
vice
with,
presidents.
yeah, and vice presidents. And I'm going to start with, because I think, and to kind of tie this into the series and podcasts and, true crime and how we're fascinated with it, whether it's been the news, again, or books or podcasts or musicals. This one really was excited to do because there's a podcast named Bagman. It's a podcast, a book, and an upcoming film as well. So Spiro who? You may have never heard the name Spiro Agnew. He also went by Ted, so Ted Agnew, but he was once our vice president under President Richard Nixon. He was a little known politician before that from Maryland. And so, how did he become the vice president? He basically got the notice of Nixon. Many in the Republican Party did not want him as the choice for running with Nixon. And Nixon said, "Oh, no, no, he's great. He's an old fashioned patriot. I like him." And so he's on the ticket with Nixon in 1968. He then will become popular during the day when he catches the attention of the public because of a speech he gives in the Midwest Regional Republican meeting in November of 1969. It was titled "The Responsibilities of Television." He did not trust the media at all. He's the old school media's bad guy, and that everything's fake and that they're terrible and don't listen to them. In fact, he said that the network news at the time was tiny and a tiny and close fraternity of privileged men. He voices concerns that they have way too much influence. There's not enough checks on their reporting and the business that they do. And he said that they were wrong. One thing he was kind of um, bashing the news for was he said that the news had attacked Nixon's famous silent majority speech on Vietnam, and he said that was wrong. He said that the network should be a lot more responsive to the people and the nation. And he historically is a vice president, and I think politician is one of the most polarizing politicians historically that we've seen. His administration received a ton of support. For people that would write in and say, "Oh, we're glad someone's finally speaking up for the truth and for the little guy." And again, this kind of mirrors some of the stuff we hear today when we hear about the news and etc. Some claim, in fact, it was really the start of the culture war between politicians and the news that we're seeing today. So I thought that was a really, really interesting part of that. So behind the scenes, where it all also gets really interesting is three federal prosecutors in Maryland are working on a case, and they're expediting it because Watergate's happened, and they fear that Agnew's going to become president. In 1973, he's facing possible impeachment stemming from criminal charges from this investigation of accepting payoffs like bribery and extortion from contractors, which he's been doing for years, ever since he was in Maryland. There in Bagman, if you listen to the podcast, people are literally delivering money in envelopes to him both in Maryland and in the White House. So this guy's doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. So he basically is forced to resign. And Nixon at the time, I think initially was hesitant, but then as when Watergate happens, he's like, yeah, we need to get Agnew out of here because I can't handle both of these, I guess, scandals at the same time, if that makes sense. So the Watergate break-in happens in 1972. Again, the pressure's already on Nixon when Agnew is trying to, I guess, deflect from his scandal, his bribery scandal. And it's interesting because he gets more combative, Agnew does, with the media at this point, and he says, "I will not resign. You know, everything's fake. The college elite are in charge. They're a core. What was it? A fake core of impudent snobs," was the one quote that I found. And he tries to actually, Agnew tries to get the House to go through an impeachment. He actually wants to be impeached because he thinks they'll be more favorable than the courts. So he talks to, but Speaker Carl Albert, who's a Democrat, says, no, thanks, we're not going to impeach you. We're going to let the courts take care of it. And so he resigns in 1973, October of 1973. He'll take a plea deal on felony tax evasion to avoid prison. But he is sentenced to 3 years probation and fined only $10,000, which at that time was more money. One of the reasons, again, that we know so much about what really happened is that Attorney General Richardson at the time demanded, as part of the plea, that there was documentation and a full accounting of all of the different crimes. So it showed right at the start of his career, for example, if you read through all of those documents, he took kickbacks and extorted all sorts of people. And it looked like to the tune of about $85,000, which I know right now does not seem like a lot, but it was at that time. So Nixon then, for the first time in U.S. history, uses the 25th Amendment to appoint his replacement. So Gerald Ford will become vice president and Agnew's out. And I'll just real quick say Ford was a no-brainer choice at this point. He was very well liked and respected. He spent 25 years in Congress. His final 9 years was minority leader in the House. And there's a lot of speculation that he did not want this job, that he originally, if you look at the Ford Library papers, it looks like he thought he was part of the search committee and ended up being the choice, and that he was not happy about it at all. So at the start of Watergate, how'd this break-in happen? I want to say it's almost like no one was watching. It's really weird. If you read the documentation on this one, the break-in happens on June 17th of 1972. It's in the middle of the night. Vietnam has been going on for a while. President Eisenhower had given his domino speech, for example, in 1954. So, we're talking, we're still dragging through this particular period. But in 1972, people I think are still focused on exterior things and not interior in the U.S. And also, to give you perspective for those who know some history, the Pentagon Papers were published in 1971. So we're talking about the year before this happened. So by December of 1972, also, we've got Nixon launching major airstrikes in Vietnam. So again, attention is not on Watergate, is what I'm getting at. Watergate initially, you know, see, is reported slowly. There's a podcast on this, and Amazon has a program called Slow Burn. And that's SLOW and then Burn BURN. If you want to really learn a lot of detail about Watergate and behind the scenes, I highly recommend Slow Burn, both the podcast and the Amazon show of that. Um, and so what you see on the screen is the night of the break-in, the security guard, Frank Willis, notices something odd. He finds the doors basically on the B2 and B3 level stuffed with paper to keep them unlocked, and tape on the door of the Democratic National Convention office to keep it open. And so he calls the police to come around 2 a.m. And that log is actually the physical log of his notes on that night. And then so reporters the next day begin showing up, and that includes the famous Woodward and Bernstein reporters. And they basically, Woodward and Bernstein are able to connect a lot of the dots through their reporting. There's 5 burglars who are identified and caught. The FBI also identifies one of the burglars is E. Howard Hunt. He's a former CIA officer, and they connect McCord, one of the guys, the security coordinator, McCord, to Nixon's reelection campaign. So there's a lot of connections made through this reporting and the investigation that goes on. One of the famous audio tapes comes out, and you can hear. It's just 2 days after Hunt is pulled in by the police, and it says that Nixon and Colson talk about this, and Nixon says this whole thing's going to be forgotten. No one's going to care. And I have there on the slide, it says Nixon, Colson, and Nixon. Just a brief readout about how unconcerned Nixon is that this is happening, which is just amazing to me. In fact, he probably is right at the time because he'll be reelected in 1972 and wins 61% of the popular vote and 521 electoral votes. And to give you perspective, McGovern, his opposition, only got 17 electoral votes and only won 2 states. So I guess less than 5 months later, polling shows in his reelection, it's fine. So that was a really interesting, I think, fact about the reports and the burglary. It takes a while for this thing to get off and to get reported more seriously. And so a few days later, after the first investigations, his Nixon discusses the investigation also with his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, and he Haldeman and John Ehrlichman from Nixon's office tell the CIA to thwart the FBI investigation. They also talk about a plan with an ally in the FBI, a guy named Mark Felt, and Felt will be revealed as Deep Throat. So Deep Throat is, if you know anything about the Woodward and Bernstein reporting, their source was this person named Deep Throat, and forever people did not know who that was. And it's Mark Felt who was talking with Nixon's people and was kind of, I guess, behind the scenes telling on them. So much would be found out about what went on by a voice activated recording system that Nixon himself installed. So Nixon put in the tape recording system. And through all of this, we're able to kind of make a connection to that there's a $25,000 check directly from the Nixon campaign into one of the burglars' accounts. So all these connections are happening. So by the end of January 1973, and this is the start of Nixon's second term, 7 people had all pled guilty or been convicted of the charges. So at this point, we know pretty much what's happening. And then John Dean, while he's trying to keep everything in order, he's voicing concerns to Nixon about, hey, this is too close to you. We need to fix this. And Dean will eventually turn state's evidence and testify before Congress about everything he knows. So, while that's going on, Nixon's trying to deflect blame. He gives a speech that says he's innocent. He doesn't know what's going on. He blames his aides for keeping him in the dark. I don't know anything. And that I'm going to take charge and find out the truth. That's what he actually tells the American public. And we know that's not what happens. The tapes are released. And on the tapes, he responds, if you go through the tapes, it basically shows that he was a part of it, and there was no question that he was active in the plot. So the records were eventually subpoenaed for those tapes too, and Nixon instead tries to, I guess, and this happens a lot. If you ask for stuff, the opposition will often give you a ton of information hoping to hide things. So he releases 1,250 pages of transcripts, not the actual tapes. And this goes to the Supreme Court. He says he doesn't have to release the actual tapes because of executive privilege. And the court says, no, you don't have executive privilege when it comes to this type of investigation. And so on July 27th, 1974, the House of Representatives passes the first 3 articles of impeachment. And I didn't put that on the slide, what those 3 are. They're really detailed. You can actually read them online, but the first one is obstruction of justice. The second one deals with violating constitutional rights of citizens, and the third one is abuse of power. So, in wrapping this up, Nixon's going to be the first and only U.S. president to resign from office because of this type of scandal. He's pardoned a month later by President Ford. And many were very, very, very upset by this. I have there on the bottom of this slide the quote that Nixon says and also the paper. Both are going to claim it's basically to move on and to avoid more public scrutiny and pain, so to speak. And
Yeah, Ford
last,
really thought that it would tear the nation apart to have to hear every little dirty thing Nixon had done.
and I'm telling you, if it's for students, if you have time to listen to Slow Burn, the podcast, or watch it, I kind of see where that could be the case if all of that stuff came out at the time. It was I was in shock, and I liked this stuff, and I was like, wow, okay, because a lot of stuff gets declassified down the road, and so the National Archives won't release it until much later. And I think I wonder if the public had known, how would they have thought about it?
Oh, we still don't know all of it because Henry
True.
Kissinger's papers are not open yet.
Yeah. And I just think it'll be interesting to see those. The Ford Library has a ton of papers. The picture here is his testimony to Congress on why he's going to pardon. Um, you know, it's just, he says at the bottom there, yet to forgive is not to forget the lesson of evil in whatever way evil has. Let's see if I can read this. Course, something against operated against us, so you can see he really is trying to, I think, walk a line and figure out how to deal with this. I don't think it was a lose-lose situation for him, I think, regardless at the time.
Yeah, you have to feel bad for Ford. He's really the victim in this.
Yeah, he didn't want the job, he had to make the decision. I would not want to have been in his shoes. So I guess afterwards he goes out and tells the public, my fellow Americans, our long national nightmares over, and takes, obviously, there's a picture of him taking the oath of office. But it was interesting to pull the Pew Research Public Trust in Government data, 1958 to 2021, and you can see that Nixon, when that happens, it's pretty much a downward trend. So, I don't know that our long national nightmare was over. I think it might have continued, but maybe I'm being pessimistic. So,
In
um,
this data, though, there is one spike here in George W. Bush. Can you speak to that?
yeah, 9/11. So anytime you have an event that kind of pulls the nation together, 9/11. Think about, well, many of you probably won't remember, but if you were able to remember 9/11, just the amount of flags and the patriotism and the pulling together as a country, that's that spike. So, I didn't check on the Bush Senior. I'm wondering if that's the Operation Desert Storm on that one. I would
Yeah, and I see a
bet it
little
is.
spike here with Oklahoma City bombing.
Yep, Clinton. Yeah,
Mm.
definitely. Because that was, yeah, it would have been right at the end of his. So, I was in Oklahoma City when that happened. So that
Oh,
would
wow.
probably be about, yeah, that's about right, the right time. So yeah. But anyway, it's interesting to look at that data. I mean, the polls show that only about 1/4 of Americans say they can trust government in Washington to do what's right. So it's really kind of a sad, I think, sad state of affairs. But and I pulled one more Pew Research polling, and because I thought it was interesting to look at Republicans and Democrats, and I think you can see that whoever's in office tends to get a little bit of a bump in that trust in government by their party and supporters, which makes sense. So, um, but definitely a downward trend. And I guess our very last slide is, in us two talking about it, we could have talked more, and I already did a lot, I know, but and Misty, we just, I mean, there's so much. And so this list is just a sampling of some other ones that are really fun to look at if you get a chance. But there's more, and again, it's nothing new, and there's a lot, and it's shocking.
No,
And
it's just government is made up of people, and people are flawed.
true.
So it should be no surprise that our government can also be flawed.
Yeah, I just circle back to it fascinates me, and how many of these people get reelected, or get away with this, and just it's so crazy, so I guess the distrust in government thing, kind of goes hand in hand with it. Maybe, I don't know, I'm being pessimistic there, but it's a fun thing to look at.
All right, so we have the attendance link in the credit or in the chats right now. So click on that. That's how you get credit for attending. Your instructors may have different policies on this. So some put it in immediately. Some of us, like me, do it monthly. Some people do it at the very end of the semester. So just read your instructor's policies. They'll let you know. If you have questions, email them. And then we do have one more of these webinars in May, True Crime Sociology. So we're going to have our resident sociologist use her discipline to examine true crime. So I'm excited about that one. If you have questions, put them in the chat. If not, thank you for attending.
Thank you guys for attending.